My fiancée ambushed me with a prenup at a $1.90 steak dinner. Her friends applauded. Her lawyer smiled. I closed the folder, stood up, and said, "Enjoy your legal buffet." Next day, her attorney called. "What did you do with your estate?" It was already gone. Have you ever noticed how wealthy people have this uncanny gift for turning a perfectly enjoyable dinner into some kind of hostage situation? I'm talking about the type of person who can't appreciate a beautifully cooked steak without attaching some kind of emotional price tag to it. That's exactly what went down on what was supposed to be a romantic evening overlooking San Francisco Bay. Except romance had apparently clocked out early, and no one had bothered to give me a heads up. We were at Swan, one of those rooftop spots where the waitstaff speaks in whispers and the wine menu requires both a translator and possibly a second mortgage. Rachel had insisted on the place, said it was perfect for a celebration, which in hindsight should have been my first warning sign, because in my experience, when someone tells you something is perfect, they're usually about to make it the exact opposite. The view was breathtaking, I'll give her that. The bay spread out like liquid silver beneath the setting sun. Sailboats drifting along without a care in the world, which made exactly one of us. The table was packed with her friends, and I use that term loosely, because half of them I'd never laid eyes on before that night, and the other half I'd crossed paths with once at some charity gala where everyone pretended to care about endangered wildlife while sipping champagne that cost more than actual conservation efforts. There was Bethany, who worked in private equity, which I'm pretty sure translates to I shuffle rich people's money around and act like it's complicated. There was James, whose entire identity lived inside his watch collection. And then there was the lawyer. Harold Dempsey, Esquire, attorney at law, guardian of assets, destroyer of good energy. The man waltzed in wearing a tuxedo that probably cost more than my first car, sporting one of those smiles that says I bill $800 an hour, and right now I'm billing you just for thinking about me. He settled into our table like he'd received a formal invitation to Thanksgiving dinner, which struck me as bizarre immediately, because who brings their attorney to a romantic dinner? Apparently, Rachel does. I was halfway through my steak, a glorious $90 cut of beef that had been raised on organic grass and probably daily motivational speeches, when Rachel tapped her champagne flute with one of those tiny dessert spoons. The whole table went quiet, and that is never a good sign. In my experience, when wealthy people stop talking and start listening, somebody's about to get played. And the smart money said that somebody was me. "Before we lock in the wedding plans," Rachel said, her voice carrying across the table with the confidence of someone who'd been rehearsing this in front of a mirror for days. "There's just one small thing we need to take care of." She smiled at me like she'd just announced we were adopting a puppy. Everyone else at the table was smiling too. Nodding along like this was some charming romantic tradition I'd somehow missed in all my years on Earth. That's when Harold the Destroyer reached into his briefcase, an actual leather briefcase that probably had its own liability coverage, and produced a folder. Not just any folder, but one of those high-end ones with an embossed cover and a little ribbon tie. He slid it across the table toward me like a Vegas dealer. "Except in Vegas, at least you know going in that you're losing money. It's just a prenuptial agreement," Rachel said, still smiling, still acting like this was perfectly routine, completely normal protocol for people in our position. Our position. I love that. As if we were both titans of industry instead of me being a guy who'd busted his tail to build a solid life, and her being someone who'd inherited enough money to purchase a small nation and was now apparently anxious I might try to take a piece of it. Her friends actually applauded. I am not joking. They clapped like she'd just solved a global crisis instead of insulting me in front of a room full of strangers. James said something about being smart, and Bethany nodded knowingly like she'd watched this film before and already knew the ending. I opened the folder, because what else was I supposed to do? Page 1 seemed reasonable enough. Boilerplate stuff about keeping separate property, fine. Page 2 started getting a little murky with language about income disparity management and asset protection protocols. By page 10, I was reading things like waiver of spousal support and limitation of community property rights, and my personal highlight, acknowledgement of financial inequality and acceptance of same. Let me translate that for you in plain English. Everything she owned would stay hers forever, and everything I own would become a fun little footnote in legal history titled "Good luck proving that was ever yours." The document essentially said that if we ever divorced, I'd be entitled to whatever coins happened to fall out of her couch cushions, and honestly, I'd probably still have to fight her for those. I sat there reading clause after miserable clause, each one more offensive than the last, while Rachel watched me with this expectant expression, like she was waiting for me to say, "Oh honey, this is wonderful, where do I sign?" Harold the Destroyer sat with his hands folded, already mentally spending his consultation fee on a new boat or whatever lawyers buy when they're not busy dismantling people's dignity. Here's the thing about a moment like that. You've got two choices. You can explode, Start yelling, flip the table, give everyone a scene they'll talk about for months. Or you can do something that costs you absolutely nothing, scares everyone in the room, and makes you the classiest person at the table, even while you're quietly coming apart inside. I went with option 2. I closed the folder with deliberate care, making sure the ribbon tie was neat. I picked up my cloth napkin, the expensive kind that probably cost more than my whole outfit, folded it precisely, and set it down beside what was left of my $90 steak. I stood up slowly, took one breath, and looked around at every expectant face at that table. "Enjoy your legal buffet," I said, my voice steady and calm, like I was commenting on the weather or pointing out a decent bottle of wine. Then I pushed my chair in, because even in moments of complete emotional wreckage, I have standards, and headed for the exit. The silence behind me was absolutely delicious. Nobody said a single word. Nobody moved to stop me. I could feel every set of eyes on my back as I passed other tables, walked past the horrified hostess, past the bewildered valet who'd probably never seen anyone leave Swan before dessert. And speaking of dessert, they were supposed to serve this fancy Italian tiramisu at $40 a slice. I'd been looking forward to it all week. But you know what tastes better than $40 tiramisu? Dignity. Self-respect. The understanding that you just removed yourself from a situation that would have eaten you alive for however many years it lasted. I walked out of that restaurant in what felt, in my head, like cinematic slow motion, even though in reality I was probably just walking at a completely ordinary human pace. But mentally, there was dramatic music playing and the lighting was hitting me just right. I was the lead character in a film who just delivered the perfect one-liner before the building went up in flames. Because here's what I figured out standing in that parking lot, with the smell of expensive food and cheap betrayal in the air: silence is a weapon. Probably the most powerful one you can own, because it costs nothing, terrifies everyone who encounters it, and when you deploy it correctly, when you just rise from your seat, say one perfect sentence, and walk out, you carry yourself with so much composure that even your enemies have to respect it. I got in my car, turned the ignition, and drove away from that rooftop restaurant without a single glance in the rearview mirror. My phone was already buzzing in my pocket, but I didn't touch it. Not yet. That could wait until I was back home, where I could enjoy whatever desperate messages were surely stacking up. The bay glittered behind me, and somewhere at that table, a group of people was probably sitting in stunned silence wondering what the hell had just happened. And Rachel, poor, calculated Rachel, was probably beginning to realize she'd shown her hand way too soon and lost the only game that mattered. When I pulled into my driveway about 20 minutes later, I still hadn't looked at my phone. It was buzzing like a trapped wasp against my leg, relentless and persistent, the way only someone who desperately needs you to validate their terrible decisions can manage. But I wasn't ready for that just yet. First, I needed to sit in my car and actually process what had happened, which is really just a fancy way of saying I needed to laugh until my ribs ached. The kind of laughter that rises up from somewhere deep in your chest. The kind that bubbles up when life becomes so genuinely absurd that your only real options are to laugh or to cry, and crying felt like giving Rachel too much credit. So I sat in my driveway, both hands still on the steering wheel, and I laughed. Not the bitter, hollow kind that people do when they're quietly furious. This was pure, genuine amusement. The kind you feel when you suddenly realize you've been living inside a sitcom for the past 6 months and you're only just now catching the laugh track. Think about it. I had just been ambushed at a high-end restaurant with a prenuptial agreement that essentially said, "Thanks for showing up, here's your consolation prize of absolutely nothing." Surrounded by people who applauded like trained performers. Orchestrated by a woman I was supposed to marry in 3 months. Coordinated by a lawyer who probably went home that night and told his wife he'd had a productive evening. If that's not premium sitcom material, I honestly don't know what is. I half expected a studio audience to start cheering. After about 5 minutes of what probably looked like a full breakdown from any neighbor peeking out their window, I finally fished my phone out of my pocket. The screen was lit up like a Christmas tree. 12 missed calls. 23 text messages. And it wasn't even 10 o'clock yet. I scrolled through them with the detached curiosity of someone reading someone else's mail. Rachel had fired off 6 messages in rapid succession, each one a masterclass in damage control. "Marcus, where did you go? You're being dramatic. Can we please talk about this like adults? You didn't even let me explain. This is embarrassing." And finally, the one that made me actually snort out loud, "You're overreacting. Let's talk tomorrow." Overreacting. I love that. I'd been handed a legal document that basically said, "I don't trust you, I never will," and I wanted that documented in writing with a dozen coached witnesses present to applaud on cue. And I was overreacting because I didn't stick around to negotiate the terms of my own public humiliation. Sure, Rachel. That tracks. But there was more. Harold the Destroyer had also chimed in, and you could practically hear the billable hours accumulating with every word. Mr. Whitman, I understand tonight's presentation may have come as a surprise. Please know that all terms in the agreement are negotiable. We can arrange a private meeting to address any concerns. These structures are standard practice for couples with significant asset disparities. I remain at your disposal. Asset disparities. Nice touch. Very measured. Very let me insult you with professional vocabulary. I could picture Harold parked in his home office, mahogany decor, definitely pretentious, typing this out over a glass of scotch, feeling very pleased with himself for being so reasonable. I didn't respond to either of them. Not a single character. Because here's something I understood a long time ago, back when I was just starting out and dealing with people who assumed they could push me around. The most powerful thing you can do when someone expects a reaction is to give them absolutely nothing. Silence makes people unravel. It makes them second-guess every decision. It makes them fill the emptiness with their own worst fears. And best of all, it costs you nothing. Instead of typing a response, I went inside my house, my beautiful, fully paid off house that I'd purchased with money I'd earned over years of actual work, and walked straight to my home office. I had some files to reorganize, because apparently this evening had turned into the kind of night where you reevaluate everything while still wearing a dress shirt that smells like good cologne and quiet devastation. I unlocked the cabinet and pulled out my estate files. I kept them color-coded because I'm organized, not because I'm a control freak. There was the green folder labeled active, current investments, live projects, things that needed attention. There was the blue folder labeled archive, closed deals, historical records, the financial equivalent of a photo album. And then there was the red folder. The red folder was labeled apocalypse. And it held exactly what you'd expect. Contingency plans for when everything falls apart. Divorce protocols, asset protection strategies, trust restructuring procedures, emergency contacts for attorneys who specialize in making problems disappear cleanly. I'd put this folder together years before Rachel ever came into my life, because I'd watched too many people get wiped out by trusting people who hadn't earned it. I pulled out the red folder, flipped it open, and grabbed a pen. At the top of a blank page, I wrote Rachel Abernathy in capital letters. Then I drew one long, satisfying line through it and moved her entire file from active to apocalypse. It felt good. It felt right. It felt like the kind of organized, quiet vengeance that Martha Stewart would fully endorse. While I was reorganizing my life, my phone kept buzzing. I glanced at it without picking it up, a skill I'd sharpened over years of dealing with people who treat their emergencies like they're automatically yours. More messages from Rachel. One from Bethany, probably trying to smooth things over. Two from numbers I didn't recognize, which meant her friends were now inserting themselves, which was just fantastic. I ignored every single one of them and went to the kitchen. You know what's genuinely great about living alone? You can eat whatever you want, whenever you want, and nobody's there to critique your choices or suggest you order something more sophisticated. I found a container of leftover Chinese noodles in the fridge, 3-day-old lo mein from that place down on Market Street that stays open until 2 in the morning and has absolutely no judgment about your life choices. I dumped the noodles in a bowl, hit the microwave for exactly 2 minutes and 30 seconds, and grabbed a bottle of wine from the rack. Not the nice stuff I saved for company or special occasions. I went straight for the $8 Cabernet from Trader Joe's, the one with the kangaroo on the label that probably tastes like mild regret and questionable decisions, but costs less than the appetizers I never got to finish at dinner. I poured myself a generous glass. And by generous, I mean almost to the brim, like someone who never learned about proper wine portions and doesn't particularly care. I sat down at my kitchen table with my lukewarm noodles and my budget wine and my freshly reorganized life. Then I raised my glass to the empty room and said out loud, like a total lunatic, here's to peace, quiet, and keeping my damn money. I took a sip. It tasted like victory, the kind produced by a winery that believes in quantity over quality. The noodles were a little soft. The vegetables had definitely seen better days. And here I was eating dinner alone at 10 on a Friday night after walking out of what was supposed to become a marriage. And you know what? It was perfect. Completely, genuinely perfect. Because here's the thing nobody warns you about when you walk away from something toxic, the immediate aftermath feels strangely peaceful. No more pretending. No more performing. No more waiting for the other shoe to drop, because the shoe already dropped, and you sidestepped it like a champion. My phone buzzed again. I glanced at the screen, saw Rachel's name, and smiled, because I knew exactly what was happening on her end. She was panicking. Harold was probably panicking. Her friends were definitely dissecting my exit in some group chat, analyzing every move like it was a reality show plot twist. And all of them were waiting for me to engage, to argue, To give them something to negotiate with. But I wasn't going to. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Maybe not ever. Because nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, destabilizes a control freak more than being ignored by someone who was supposed to fall apart. They expect outrage, confrontation, drama. They prepare for arguments and countermoves and emotional explosions. What they never prepare for is silence. Steady, deliberate, maddening silence. I finished my noodles, washed the bowl, and put my wine glass in the dishwasher like a functioning adult. Then I switched my phone to Do Not Disturb, walked to my bedroom, and slept better than I had in months. Tomorrow, Rachel was going to wake up to a completely different kind of problem. But tonight I was just a guy who'd eaten cheap noodles, drunk cheaper wine, and felt like the wealthiest man alive. I woke up the next morning feeling like I'd just had the most restorative sleep of my entire life, which is strange considering I'd technically blown up my engagement less than 12 hours earlier. But there's something about removing toxic people from your orbit that works better than any sleep aid on the market. 0 side effects. Maximum clarity. And you wake up with this remarkable sense of calm that no amount of money can replicate. It was Saturday, which meant 0 obligations and unlimited possibilities. I made myself a real breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, bacon that came out a touch crispier than intended, but whatever, I'm not a chef, and carried it out to my back porch. I've got a simple setup out there, a table, a couple of chairs, and a decent neighborhood view. Nothing like Rachel's Bayview penthouse, but it's mine, it's paid off, and nobody can strip it away from me with a legal document. I was sitting there sipping coffee and watching a duck waddle across my yard like it owned the property when I finally checked my phone. Still on Do Not Disturb, but the notifications were stacking up like digital tumbleweeds. 37 new messages. 19 missed calls. 3 voicemails I would probably never play, because voicemails are where self-respect goes to die. But here's the thing, I wasn't checking because I cared what Rachel had to say. I was checking because I was waiting to see exactly when the second bomb would go off. See, while everyone was fixated on the prenup drama, they'd completely overlooked a small financial arrangement Rachel and I had put in place about 6 months earlier. We'd opened what she called a joint vineyard account for our shared dream project. Rachel had this fantasy about owning a Napa Valley vineyard, one of those estates where wealthy people go to pretend they understand wine while sipping their own mediocre Cabernet and feeling deeply sophisticated. She'd sold me on it as our legacy, our retirement vision, our contribution to the agricultural arts. She had approximately 1 million romantic ways to describe what was essentially a very expensive hobby requiring 0 actual farming knowledge. We both contributed to the account, though in the interest of honesty, I'd put in significantly more, because I had actual liquid assets while her money was tied up in trusts and investments and whatever else people with inherited wealth do to keep it from sitting still. The account was meant for land acquisition, consultants, soil analysis, all that vineyard startup romance that sounds thrilling until you realize it's basically just throwing money at dirt and hoping grapes eventually show up. What Rachel hadn't noticed, because she never truly read the fine print on anything that didn't involve protecting her own interests, was that the account carried a custodial control clause. And the custodian was yours truly. Which meant 1 phone call and a few signatures was all it took for me to restructure the entire thing without her consent. And that's precisely what I'd done. On Thursday afternoon, right after Rachel texted me can't wait for our special dinner tomorrow night. With roughly 17 heart emojis, I'd walked into my bank and moved the entire vineyard account into an independent trust. Not a joint trust. Not a family trust. An independent, irrevocable, Marcus Whitman is the only person who matters trust. The timing was immaculate. She'd already scheduled her prenup ambush for Friday evening. I'd already executed my financial exit on Thursday afternoon. We were like 2 chess players who had no idea we were playing entirely different games. So there I was, Saturday morning, tossing crumbs to a duck who had absolutely no awareness it was witnessing the aftermath of financial warfare, when I imagined Rachel waking up in her penthouse. Probably pouring some organic, single origin, ethically sourced coffee that costs more per pound than actual gold, and deciding to check the vineyard account. Maybe she wanted to transfer some funds. Maybe she wanted to feel productive after the disaster of Friday night. Maybe she just wanted to look at the balance and remind herself things were fine. Whatever her reason, I knew the exact moment it happened, because my phone lit up with an incoming call from a number I recognized immediately. First Pacific Bank. Private Wealth Management Division. Rachel's bank. Our bank, technically, for the vineyard account. I let it ring. Instead, I topped off my coffee and waited. The duck quacked at something, probably judging everything about my choices. Ducks are more judgmental than people give them credit for. I tossed it another piece of toast. 3 minutes later, the same number called again. Then a text from Rachel arrived in all capitals. Call me now. Full caps. That's how you know someone's morning has completely unraveled, when they abandon punctuation and just start screaming through their keyboard. I pictured the scene perfectly. Rachel, probably still in designer pajamas that cost more than most people's monthly rent, sitting at her kitchen island, laptop open, staring at a banking portal delivering very unwelcome news. The account was still there. The money was still there. But the access was absolutely gone. I imagined her calling the bank, getting transferred approximately 47 times because that's what banks do when the problem is too awkward to handle quickly. Until finally she reached someone in custodial services. Someone, let's call her Jennifer, because there's always a Jennifer in situations like these, who'd pulled up the account with the practiced efficiency of someone who deals with wealthy people's crises all day and has zero emotional investment in any of them. "Ma'am," Jennifer probably said, using that professionally pleasant voice that means she's reading from a script and absolutely does not care about your feelings. "I'm showing a change in custodial control on this account." "What kind of change?" Rachel would have asked, her voice climbing that ladder of panic that starts at confusion and ends at full hysteria. "The account has been moved under an independent trust structure," Jennifer would have explained, probably also scrolling her own email, checking her own calendar, because this was just another Tuesday for her. "Mr. Whitman executed the restructuring on Thursday at 3:47 p.m. Thursday at 3:47 p.m. I love that timestamp. It was proof positive that I'd done this before the prenup disaster, which meant it wasn't retaliation. It was just smart planning. Proactive asset management. Me being responsible about my financial future. But it was a joint account," Rachel probably sputtered, because wealthy people always assume joint means they hold the power. "It was a joint access account with custodial designation, ma'am," Jennifer would have clarified, and I'd bet real money she put some emphasis on that ma'am with the quiet satisfaction of a bank employee delivering bad news to someone who's been rude to service workers their whole life. "The custodian holds the right to restructure as needed. The funds are now held in the Whitman Independent Agricultural Trust, registered under Federal Sovereign Shelter Status." Federal Sovereign Shelter Status. Lord, I love my lawyer. That was Malcolm's idea, my old friend from policy work who also happened to be a trust attorney with both a sharp mind and an appreciation for creative legal architecture. Putting the trust under Federal Sovereign Shelter Status didn't just protect the assets. It placed them in an entirely different legal universe. It would take an act of Congress to get anywhere near that money. "I need to speak to a manager," Rachel would have demanded, because when wealthy people don't get what they want from the first person, they escalate, like the world's most entitled customers. "Of course, ma'am. Let me transfer you to our senior custodial oversight department. Please hold." And then, my absolute favorite part, she would have been placed on hold. Probably listening to some inoffensive jazz designed to be just irritating enough to make you question whether the money in your account is worth this level of psychological wear. Meanwhile, I was still on my porch, still feeding my duck companion, still savoring the best morning I'd had in recent memory. My phone buzzed again. Another missed call from Rachel, then a text, "What did you do to the Vineyard account?" I finished my coffee, stood up, stretched like a man who is nowhere urgent to be and absolutely nothing to prove, and typed out a reply, gave it a new home. It needed stability. Short. Simple. Devastating. I hit send and turned my phone back to do not disturb. The duck looked at me with what I can only describe as approval in its small dark eyes. Or maybe it was just angling for more toast. Either way, I tossed it the last piece and went inside to brew another pot. Because here's the reality of moving money around before someone tries to take advantage of you, it's not vindictiveness. It's intelligence. Rachel had spent weeks carefully choreographing her prenup ambush, locking down every asset, sealing off every clause, making absolutely certain I couldn't touch a dime of hers. She brought a lawyer to dinner, for heaven's sake. She orchestrated a public performance with witnesses and champagne flutes. And she'd somehow forgotten that I was the person who'd helped write half the tax code she was trying to weaponize against me. That I'd spent 20 years learning how to protect assets, structure trusts, and move money in ways that would make a magician envious. That I didn't need scenes or high-priced attorneys or public confrontations. I just needed a Thursday afternoon, a skilled lawyer, and the discipline to read every single word of every document I'd ever put my name on. The sun was climbing higher. The duck had wandered off to bother someone else. And somewhere across the city, Rachel was probably still on hold, listening to smooth jazz, slowly understanding that she'd picked a fight with someone who was playing chess while she was still figuring out checkers. I smiled, poured another cup, and raised it to absolutely nothing. Because the best kind of victory doesn't require an audience. It doesn't need confrontation or raised voices or dramatic speeches. Sometimes it's just you, sitting on your porch, drinking average coffee, feeding a judgmental duck, and knowing that somewhere out there someone is having the worst Saturday of their entire life while you're having the best. By Saturday afternoon, Harold Dempsey, Esquire, attorney at law, champion of the wealthy, wearer of very expensive formal wear, had apparently concluded that silence wasn't working and decided it was time to bring out the heavy legal artillery. I know this because Malcolm rang me around 2 in the afternoon, laughing so hard he could barely form sentences. "Dude," he wheezed. "You have to hear this. Harold just filed an emergency injunction to freeze your estate." I was in my garage, sorting through tools I hadn't touched in 6 months, because apparently ending your engagement turns you into the kind of person who suddenly needs to alphabetize their socket wrench collection. An emergency injunction. What exactly is the emergency? That I have self-respect. "He's claiming you're concealing marital assets," Malcolm said, and I could hear papers shuffling. "Filed it with the county court about an hour ago. Wants everything frozen pending a complete financial disclosure and review." The man is really swinging here. "Let him swing," I said, setting down a hammer I'd been pretending to examine. "How long before reality punches him in the face?" "Oh, it already has," Malcolm said, and I could practically feel his grin radiating through the phone. "The county clerk is a woman named Kim Navarro. Young, sharp, doesn't take nonsense from anyone. She looked up your estate in the system and..." He paused for effect. "And?" I prompted, already knowing exactly what was coming. "She told Harold, and I'm quoting directly, 'Sir, this isn't under our jurisdiction. The estate has been moved under federal sovereign shelter status.'" Man, I wish I could have seen his face. I wasn't there, but I can picture it perfectly, and it is a beautiful image. I laughed, a full, unguarded laugh right there in my garage. Federal sovereign shelter status. Those 4 words were the most glorious combination in the English language at that particular moment. It meant my estate wasn't just shielded. It was in a completely separate legal dimension. Harold could file injunctions with the county court all day long, but it'd be like trying to serve a warrant in France using paperwork from the DMV. "What did he actually say?" I asked, settling onto my workbench like someone about to hear the greatest story ever told. "Well, according to Kim, who called me because she figured I'd enjoy the irony, he just stood there for a solid 30 seconds. Stone silent. Staring at the computer screen like it had personally betrayed him. Then he asked her to check again. She checked again. Same result. Then he asked if there might be a system error. She told him the system was working perfectly fine, but that his understanding of federal trust law might need some updating." "She did not say that," I said, genuinely delighted. "She 100% said that. Kim has a master's degree in legal administration and 3 years of dealing with pompous attorneys. She is completely immune to intimidation," Malcolm said, clearly savoring every detail. "So Harold asks for her supervisor. The supervisor comes out, checks the same screen, tells him the exact same thing. Your estate is federally sheltered. Not their circus. Not their problem." I could picture every detail perfectly. Harold, in whatever obscenely expensive suit he'd worn for the occasion, standing in the county clerk's office, which is never a glamorous environment, fluorescent lighting, linoleum floors, the faint smell of old coffee and bureaucratic resignation. Being told by someone half his age that he'd just wasted everyone's afternoon, including his own. "So what happened next?" I asked, because this story was far too good to end there. "He left. But before he left, he asked Kim if she could at least tell him where the estate was registered. She told him she legally couldn't share that information without proper federal clearance, which he didn't have. Then she asked if there was anything else she could help him with, like maybe a pamphlet on federal trust law or directions to the nearest law library." "Absolutely savage," I said. "I like this Kim. Everyone likes Kim. She's already a legend in that office. Last year she made a guy cry for trying to file a fraudulent lien," Malcolm said, shuffling more papers. "Anyway, Harold walked out about 20 minutes ago. My guess is he's currently Googling what is federal sovereign shelter status and having a small existential crisis." "Good," I said, and I meant it. Not because I'm a cruel person. But because Harold had walked into that restaurant Friday night with his expensive folder and his rehearsed smile, fully expecting to steamroll me into signing away my dignity. He'd underestimated me. And now he was learning a very costly lesson about assumptions. Malcolm and I spent a few more minutes going over the specifics, the trust architecture, the federal registration, the various legal hoops someone would need to jump through just to get within range of my assets. It really was something elegant. Malcolm had helped me build this about 2 years back, long before Rachel was ever in the picture, because I'd learned early that the right time to protect yourself is always before you actually need it. After I hung up with Malcolm, I went back inside and made a sandwich. Turkey, Swiss, mustard, lettuce, nothing fancy, Just fuel. I was standing at the counter eating it when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. But I had a fairly solid guess about who was on the other end. I answered on the third ring. Marcus Whitman speaking. Mr. Whitman, this is Harold. His voice sounded like someone who'd been gargling a mixture of gravel and disappointment. Harold Dempsey. I believe we need to have a conversation. Do we? I took a bite of my sandwich and chewed slowly. Let him hear it. Let him know I was completely unbothered. I attempted to file a protective order this afternoon regarding your estate, he said. And I had to give him some credit, he was still trying to sound professional even as I could hear the confusion simmering underneath. The county clerk informed me that your holdings are no longer subject to local jurisdiction. That's correct, I said pleasantly. Is that a problem? Silence. A long, thick silence. The kind that settles in when someone realizes they showed up to a gunfight carrying a butter knife. Mr. Whitman, may I ask what exactly you did with your estate? I smiled. That was the question I'd been waiting for. I gave it a passport, Harold. It needed a break from toxic entanglements. Another pause, even longer this time. I could practically hear the machinery turning in his head, trying to work out whether I was joking, whether this was some kind of code, whether there was a legal precedent for an estate having travel documents. I'm not entirely sure I follow, he finally said, which is attorney speak for please explain this to me like I'm 5, because I am completely at sea. It's really quite straightforward, I said, setting down my sandwich to give this conversation my full attention. My estate is now held in a federally registered independent trust with sovereign shelter status, which places it outside county court jurisdiction, state court jurisdiction, really any jurisdiction you can access without federal clearance, which I'm fairly confident you don't have. Federal clearance, he repeated, and I swear I could hear a portion of his soul quietly exiting through the phone. Mr. Whitman, this is highly unusual. Is it? I asked innocently. I thought protecting one's assets was standard practice for people with, what was the phrase you used, significant holdings. I'm just following your lead, Harold. Being smart. Being careful. Making sure everything is properly locked up. This isn't, he stopped himself, probably realizing that anything he said next would make him sound either incompetent or hypocritical. Miss Abernathy is very concerned about the vineyard account. I'd imagine so, I said cheerfully. That account is now part of the Whitman Independent Agricultural Trust, also federally registered. It's perfectly safe, perfectly protected, and completely inaccessible to people who ambush their partners with prenups over dinner. Mr. Whitman, Harold said, and his voice had shifted, from professional to something that sounded uncomfortably close to pleading, a register I'd bet he rarely used. Surely there's some arrangement we can arrive at. The prenuptial agreement is, as I mentioned, fully negotiable. We can schedule a meeting, work through your concerns. Here's the thing, Harold, I cut in, still pleasant but with an edge that could have scored glass. Last night, you sat at that table with your premium folder and your expensive tuxedo, and you smiled at me like I was someone who didn't understand what was happening. You helped orchestrate a public humiliation. You assisted Rachel in turning what should have been a private, adult conversation into a staged performance for her social circle. And now you're on the phone asking for a meeting, asking to negotiate, because you've finally realized that maybe, just maybe, you chose the wrong person to underestimate. Silence on his end. Deep, satisfying silence. So here's what I'm offering, I continued. You go back to Rachel and you explain that her financial advisor, which is me, by the way, in case she forgot, has restructured his holdings in a way that fully protects him from predatory legal arrangements. You tell her the vineyard account is secure and accounted for, just no longer within her reach. And you tell her that the next time she'd like to have a meaningful conversation about our relationship, she should try it without an audience and without legal counsel. Mr. Whitman, I really think. And Harold, I said, cutting him off one more time, because the momentum felt too good to slow down. You might want to revisit federal trust law. It's come a long way since your law school days. I'd hate for you to find yourself in this position again. Then I hung up. Mid-sentence. Which is objectively rude and subjectively the most satisfying thing I'd done all weekend. I imagined Harold sitting in his office, mahogany surroundings, law books arranged for appearance, staring at his phone like it had just said something unforgivable about his mother. I finished my sandwich, rinsed the plate, and went back to the garage. Found a level I'd been hunting for. A full set of drill bits I'd completely forgotten I owned. And a deep, settled peace that comes from knowing you just cornered a lawyer charging $800 an hour with nothing but the truth and a few well-timed words. My phone buzzed with a text from Malcolm. Harold just called me asking about federal trust law. I told him to Google it. I texted back, best Saturday ever. Found my missing level and dismantled a lawyer's confidence. Extremely productive day. Because that's exactly what happens when you play chess while everyone around you is still learning checkers. Eventually they look up from the board and realize they never had a shot. Harold had marched into the county clerk's office expecting to freeze my assets and force me back to the table. Instead, he discovered that my assets lived in another dimension entirely, his legal tactics were toothless, and the clerk had a better working knowledge of federal law than he did. And the best part of all, I'd accomplished this without raising my voice, losing my composure, or doing anything that could be held against me later. I was just a man protecting his interests, following the law, and ensuring that anyone who wanted to come after what was mine would have to work extremely hard for the privilege. The sun was beginning to lower, washing my garage in warm golden light. I put the tools away, closed everything up, and went inside to pour myself a glass of that $8 wine that was honestly getting better with every small victory. Sunday morning showed up wearing the kind of weather that makes you feel like the universe has finally taken your side. Clear sky, soft breeze, birds doing their thing without any agenda. The kind of morning that belongs in a commercial for retirement accounts or artisan coffee. I was back on my porch, which had apparently become my command center for watching the controlled demolition of my former relationship from a comfortable distance, when a courier van pulled up to the house. Now, Sunday morning courier deliveries are never casual. This isn't an Amazon package or a birthday card from your aunt. This is the kind of delivery that means someone paid a premium to make sure something reached you at a time when you weren't expecting it. It's a power move wrapped in convenience. The courier was a young guy, maybe 25, in a uniform just a little too polished for the job, a sure sign this was a premium service. He cross-checked his tablet, verified my address, then checked the tablet again, like he was confirming he had the right target for a very important operation. Marcus Whitman? He called out, even though I was standing right there on my porch holding a mug that said "World's Most Adequate Human," a Christmas gift from Malcolm 3 years back. "That's me," I said, stepping down to meet him. He handed over a large manila envelope, the reinforced, heavy-duty kind, with a weight to it that told you this was more than a few pages. "Need a signature, sir." I signed his tablet, thanked him, watched the van pull away. Then I looked at the envelope. No return address, which was classy in a vaguely threatening way. Just my name and address on clean printed labels. Professional. Impersonal. But I knew exactly what this was and where it had come from. I went back inside, refilled my coffee, and sat at the kitchen table. I could have ripped it open immediately, but where's the satisfaction in that? Let it sit. Let it wonder if I was anxious, curious, worked up. Let it learn that I open important documents on my own timeline, not anyone else's. After finishing my coffee and scrolling through a completely unrelated email from my dentist about an upcoming cleaning, which felt hilariously mundane given everything happening in my life, I finally picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside was exactly what I expected, my estate declaration. The one I'd filed on Friday morning, roughly 6 hours before the prenup ambush, because I've always believed in getting ahead of problems rather than reacting to them. Every page was present, beautifully printed on heavy, high-quality paper stock. Every clause was legible. Every signature clear. Every notary seal perfectly pressed. But here's the detail that would have sent Rachel's blood pressure into dangerous territory. Her name didn't appear anywhere in the document. Not once. Not in the beneficiary section, not on the advisory committee, not in contingency planning, not even in the acknowledgments. It was as though she'd never existed in my financial world, which, as of Friday morning, was technically accurate. In her place, the primary trustees were listed as Grace Whitman, my sister, the woman who once told Rachel to her face that her shoes were trying too hard, and Malcolm Koss, my oldest friend and current favorite human being for helping me construct this legal fortress. The secondary beneficiaries included charities I actually cared about, a scholarship fund I'd been quietly supporting for years, and absolutely zero socially ambitious ex-fiancés with trust issues. I turned the pages slowly, savoring each one. There was the asset inventory, real estate, investments, the Vineyard Trust, even my small car collection, 2 vehicles, both fully paid off, and that counts for something. The distribution schedule. The tax strategy. The contingency protocols. Everything was there. Everything was solid. Everything was sealed. And then I arrived at the truly beautiful part, the exclusion clause. This was the section Malcolm had insisted on including, the one he called the nuclear option when we were drafting it. It read, in gorgeous legal language that probably cost him 3 hours and a bottle of very good scotch. Any individual who initiates, participates in, or facilitates adversarial legal action against the estate holder, including but not limited to prenuptial negotiations conducted in bad faith, public humiliation disguised as legal planning, or attempts to coerce estate restructuring through social pressure, shall be permanently barred from any and all benefits, considerations, or acknowledgments within this estate declaration, effective immediately upon such action and irrevocable in perpetuity. I read it 3 times. Each reading was better than the last. What this said in plain language, Rachel had excluded herself. Not me, her. By staging the prenup at dinner, by turning our relationship into a legal negotiation, by making a public spectacle out of protecting her money while trying to access mine, she had personally activated the one clause that locked her out permanently. She'd fired the gun herself. I hadn't had to do a thing except watch it happen. It was, as Malcolm would say, self-executing poetic justice. Or as I preferred to call it, consequences finally catching up to actions over a very nice meal. I pictured Rachel receiving her own copy of this document, because of course she would, that's how these things work. Probably sitting in her penthouse right now, pajamas still on, surrounded by half-empty coffee cups and the specific variety of panic that comes from understanding you've just maneuvered yourself into a permanent corner. She'd call Harold immediately, no question. What does this mean? She'd demand, voice climbing that desperate ladder from confusion toward meltdown. And Harold, poor Harold, billing her at his Sunday emergency rate for the privilege of delivering more bad news, would have to explain that she'd essentially nominated herself for permanent exclusion. But we're engaged, she'd insist, waving her ring around as though jewelry had legal standing. You were engaged, Harold would correct, because lawyers treat verb tenses like sacred objects. And according to this clause, your conduct at Friday's dinner constitutes adversarial legal action conducted in bad faith. Which means what? Rachel would demand. Which means you're out. Permanently. There is no appeal window, no negotiation mechanism, no workaround. The clause is self-executing and irrevocable. Harold would probably pause here, leafing through pages, hunting for anything useful. Miss Abernathy, I have to ask, were you aware he had this clause in his estate declaration? Of course not. How would I possibly know that? Because it was filed on Friday morning, prior to your dinner, which means he anticipated your plans and protected himself before you acted. Harold would sound genuinely impressed despite himself, because even attorneys have to tip their hat to superior legal strategy. This is actually quite sophisticated estate planning. I could picture Rachel working through several shades of red as the timeline fully landed. I'd filed this Friday morning. The prenup ambush happened Friday evening. Which meant I'd already read her move and made my countermove before she'd even played her hand. I'd watched her push her chips in, and I'd simply removed myself from the table entirely. My phone buzzed. Right on schedule. It was a text from Grace. Did you actually list me as primary trustee on your estate? I texted back, yes. You have excellent judgment and you told Rachel her shoes were trying too hard. Fair point. Does this mean I have actual responsibilities now? Only if I die. Please try not to let that happen. Deal. By the way, Malcolm called me laughing. What exactly did you do? Protected my assets from predatory relationship practices. Most Marcus answer in history. I'm proud of you. Also, Rachel has been calling me. Don't pick up. Wasn't planning to. Her shoes genuinely were trying too hard. I adore my sister. She has the kind of unfiltered honesty that makes family dinners memorable and major life decisions crystal clear. When I first introduced her to Rachel at some charity event last year, Grace took one look at her and whispered, "She's calculating your net worth right now." I can see it in the way her eyes move. I'd laughed it off at the time. But Grace had been right. Grace is always right, which is alternately irritating and deeply reassuring. My phone buzzed again. Malcolm, Rachel's lawyer just called me asking if the exclusion clause is negotiable. What did you tell him? I told him that irrevocable means irrevocable, and if he doesn't understand what irrevocable means, he might want to reconsider his career path. Then I hung up. Too much? Perfect. Good. Want to grab lunch? I feel like celebrating. Celebrating what specifically? The fact that you just drafted the most beautiful piece of preemptive legal architecture I've ever witnessed. And you built it before the offense even took place. That's not revenge, that's prophecy. I smiled, looking down at the estate declaration spread across my kitchen table. He wasn't wrong. This wasn't revenge. Revenge is reactive, messy, emotional. This was just preparation. This was me paying attention when someone showed me who they were, and responding accordingly. Rachel had revealed herself the moment she proposed a joint vineyard account where she contributed less than half but expected equal authority. She'd revealed herself again when she began talking about protecting our individual interests while only meaning her own. And she'd made it unmistakable when she planned a prenup ambush with spectators and legal counsel instead of sitting down for an honest conversation like two adults. I'd just been listening. And unlike Rachel, I'd actually read every word of everything I'd ever signed, including the fine print I'd written myself. The morning sun was streaming through my kitchen window, falling across the estate declaration like a spotlight on a stage. Every page was clean. Every clause was airtight. Every decision was entirely mine. My estate. My rules. My peace of mind. I gathered all the papers, slipped them back into the envelope, and locked them in my safe. Then I texted Malcolm back, "Lunch sounds great. Pick somewhere good. I'm celebrating financial independence." "You're always celebrating something." "That's because I keep winning." And the beautiful thing was, I wasn't bragging. I was simply reporting facts. Rachel had tried to play chess, but she'd forgotten to check whether I even wanted to be at the board. So I'd picked up my pieces, redesigned the game from scratch, and left her sitting there wondering how it had all slipped away. That's how you protect yourself from relationships that were never built on solid ground. Not with anger. Not with spectacle. With paperwork, clear thinking, and a really good lawyer who has excellent taste in scotch. Malcolm and I had lunch at this Italian place downtown that makes pasta so good it probably ought to be regulated. We sat outside on the patio in that perfect kind of afternoon that makes all your problems feel impossibly distant, except I no longer had any problems, because I'd methodically dismantled them one legal document at a time. We were somewhere into our second bottle of wine, a considerably better vintage than my $8 Trader Joe's special, when Malcolm's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then started laughing hard enough to almost lose his grip on a forkful of fettuccine. "What?" I asked, twirling my own pasta like a civilized adult, despite strong internal pressure to just shovel it in. "Oh man," Malcolm wheezed, dabbing his eyes. "You remember how Rachel called me yesterday?" "Vaguely. I was busy reorganizing my garage and enjoying my life." "Well, she apparently didn't stop there. She forwarded the estate documents to her old law professor." He turned his phone toward me, showing an email chain. "Dr. Elias Monroe. The man's a genuine legend. 30 years at Yale. Wrote half the textbooks on estate law. Literally invented several of the trust structures we use today." I leaned in, now fully interested. "She sent my estate declaration to Elias Monroe." "She did." And he just responded. Malcolm was grinning like it was Christmas morning. "You want to read it, or should I perform it dramatically?" "Dramatically. Use your full lawyer voice." Malcolm cleared his throat, straightened up, and adopted the measured gravitas of someone delivering a verdict. "Dear Rachel," he began. "I have reviewed the estate declaration you forwarded to me, along with your account of the circumstances surrounding your recent engagement complications." "Engagement complications," I repeated. Elegant way to describe I laid a trap for my fiancée and it blew up in my face. "Quiet, I'm not done," Malcolm said, raising a hand. "After careful review of the documents and the timeline you provided, I find myself with one essential question. Why did you attempt to corner a man with a prenuptial agreement when he quite literally helped write portions of the tax code you're attempting to cite?" I nearly sprayed wine across the table. "He did not say that." "He absolutely did," Malcolm confirmed, scrolling on. "But it gets even better. Mr. Whitman's estate structure is not merely legally sound, it is frankly a masterclass in preemptive asset protection. The self-executing exclusion clause is particularly elegant. I've seen comparable mechanisms deployed in corporate law, but rarely applied to personal estates with this degree of precision. The federal sovereign shelter status is creative, thorough, and nearly impossible to challenge without expenditures that would far exceed any conceivable recovery." "I genuinely like this man," I said, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the wine. "Furthermore," Malcolm continued, visibly relishing every word, "the timing of the filing, executed prior to your prenuptial presentation, demonstrates that Mr. Whitman anticipated your approach and responded not with emotion, but with strategy. This is not the behavior of someone acting impulsively or out of spite. This is the behavior of someone who understands legal protection and exercises it with discipline." "Discipline," I echoed. "I should frame that." "He's still not done destroying her," Malcolm said, scrolling further. "Rachel, I speak to you now not as a legal consultant, but as someone who has known you since you enrolled in my estate planning 301 course. You have always been sharp, driven, and capable. However, you have also consistently underestimated people you perceived as less socially positioned than yourself. Mr. Whitman may not come from generational wealth, but he is demonstrably a sophisticated legal thinker with resources and knowledge that rival, if not surpass, many of the attorneys you have relied upon." I raised my glass in quiet tribute to not coming from old money and still outthinking everyone in the room. Malcolm clinked his glass against mine. "To that. But here comes the closing argument. My professional recommendation is to cease all legal action immediately. The estate architecture is impenetrable. The exclusion clause was triggered by your own conduct, and any attempt to contest it will generate substantial legal costs with virtually no realistic chance of success. My personal counsel is to ask yourself why you felt the need to shield yourself from someone you claim to love, and why you chose to do so through public spectacle rather than honest conversation. Regards, Dr. Elias Monroe. We sat with that for a moment. The weight of that final paragraph landing on the table between us like something perfectly cooked, precise and quietly devastating. He just academically leveled her, I said eventually. Like, that wasn't legal advice at the end. That was a professor telling his former student she'd failed both the assignment and the course. The man is a legend for a reason, Malcolm said, setting down his phone and returning to his pasta. Met him once at a conference. Sharp as a scalpel, no patience whatsoever for nonsense, and apparently zero tolerance for weaponized prenups. Did she write back? I asked, curiosity winning. Malcolm checked his phone. Oh, absolutely. She sent 3 paragraphs defending herself, justifying the prenup, explaining she was just being prudent, all the usual. He scrolled. He replied with 4 words. You were being cruel. I needed a moment with those 4 words. Not a legal argument, not a dissertation, not a paragraph of nuanced context, just 4 words that cut straight through everything to the truth of it. You were being cruel. Because that's what it was. Not careful, not strategic, not self-protective, cruel. Taking someone you claim to love and humiliating them in front of an audience because you valued your assets more than their dignity. I need to send this man something, I said. He doesn't accept gifts from parties involved in active legal situations, Malcolm said. Already looked it up. But I forwarded him a thank you on your behalf, and he replied that watching competent estate planning executed in real time was thanks enough. Professional solidarity, I said approvingly. Respect. We finished lunch in the comfortable silence of 2 people who'd known each other long enough that not every moment needs filling. Malcolm had been my friend since college, back when we were both broke and arguing about policy reform over instant noodles like it actually mattered. Now we were grown men eating good pasta and celebrating the fact that legal knowledge outlasts inherited privilege every single time. After lunch, Malcolm headed back to deal with a client situation, something about a trust fund that needed urgent attention, and only he could fix it. I went home feeling lighter than I had in months. Dr. Monroe's words hadn't been necessary, but they'd landed like a gift. Having a legendary law professor reduce the whole thing to 4 syllables, you were being cruel, was the universe handing you a gold star you hadn't asked for. I got home around 4, changed into comfortable clothes, and made a deliberate decision to accomplish absolutely nothing for the rest of the evening. I'd earned it. I'd spent an entire weekend fending off legal attacks, restructuring my financial life, and apparently impressing law school professors I'd never met. If that didn't justify a lazy Sunday evening, nothing on earth did. I was settling onto my couch with a thriller I'd been meaning to start for months, corporate espionage story that now felt almost quaint next to my actual life, when my phone rang from an unknown number. Something told me to pick it up. Marcus Whitman. Mr. Whitman, this is Bethany Chun. We met at Rachel's dinner Friday evening. Her voice was careful, strained, the way someone sounds when they're picking their footing through a conversation they're not sure how to have. Bethany, private equity Bethany, one of Rachel's friends who'd applauded the prenup like it was a graduation ceremony. I remember, I said, neutral. I want to apologize, she said, quickly, like she'd been rehearsing it. For Friday night, for clapping, for being part of that whole setup. Rachel told us it was going to be a celebration, and when the prenup came out, I just went along with it. That was wrong. That was genuinely wrong. Go on, I said, sitting up a little straighter. I've been in finance for 10 years, Bethany continued. I understand asset protection. And what Rachel did Friday wasn't asset protection, it was a power play. She positioned you to fail in front of witnesses. And I was part of that audience. I'm sorry. Apology accepted, I said, because it was. She'd been a pawn in Rachel's game, not the one dealing the cards. Thank you, she said, and the relief in her voice was audible. And for what it's worth, the way you handled it, just standing up and leaving like that was the most composed thing I've watched anyone do in years. Half the people at that table are still talking about it. Rachel is losing friends over this. That's a shame, I said, and I actually meant it. I didn't want Rachel's whole social world to crumble. I just wanted her to understand that choices carry weight. It's earned, Bethany said bluntly. She's been calling people, trying to rally support, asking everyone to validate her side of it. But Marcus, I've seen the estate documents. My firm deals in trust law. What you built isn't retaliation. It's protection. And honestly, it's impressive as hell. We talked a few more minutes, Bethany asking some professional questions about the federal shelter structure. Apparently her firm was looking at similar setups for certain clients, and me sharing general information without getting into specifics. By the time we hung up, I had a feeling Bethany was going to be just fine. She'd learned something valuable about choosing your audience carefully and not applauding someone else's cruelty. As the evening wound down, I made dinner, nothing complicated, just chicken and roasted vegetables, because adulthood occasionally requires eating something that isn't noodles, and turned over the strange arc of the weekend in my mind. Friday night, I'd walked out of a restaurant feeling blindsided and betrayed. By Sunday evening, I had a law professor complimenting my estate planning, my ex-fiancée's friends calling to apologize, and a sense of inner calm that truly cannot be purchased at any price. The thing about revenge, and I say this as someone who apparently just executed a masterclass in it without entirely intending to, is that the best kind isn't theatrical. It's not about making scenes or torching bridges or getting even in some dramatic, public fashion. The best revenge is just living well, protecting yourself with intelligence, and letting other people's poor decisions speak for themselves. Rachel had tried to pin me down with a prenup, and she'd pinned herself instead with an exclusion clause. Harold had tried to freeze my assets and frozen his own confidence instead. And Dr. Monroe, a man I'd never crossed paths with, had summed it all up with more precision than I ever could have managed. You were being cruel. I finished my dinner, washed up, and poured one last glass of wine. Not the $8 stuff and not the restaurant splurge, something right in the middle. Good enough to genuinely enjoy, affordable enough not to wince if I spilled it. Then I went out to my porch and watched the last of the daylight fade, feeling grateful for legal knowledge, loyal people, and the kind of clarity that only arrives after you walk away from someone who was never really on your side. Monday was coming. The rest of the world would return to work. Rachel would probably try a new angle. Harold would continue his quiet reckoning with federal trust law. But tonight, I was just a man with good food in his stomach, decent wine in his glass, and the best legal protection money could buy. Monday morning arrived and I woke up dangerously energized, which is never entirely a good sign. It usually means I'm about to do something that seems reasonable in the moment and haunts me just a little later. I made coffee, checked my emails, and found myself staring at an invitation I'd received 2 weeks prior and completely forgotten about. It was from Wealth and Estate Quarterly, one of those professional publications that financial advisors and estate attorneys read to feel current and occasionally to actually learn something. They'd asked me to submit a short piece for their Expert Perspectives column, a thought, an insight, something about estate planning. Nothing heavy. Maximum 100 words. I'd been ignoring it because I'd been busy planning a wedding that was never going to happen. But now I had free time, strong opinions, and a weekend's worth of lived experience that had given me some very specific thoughts about trust, relationships, and the value of legal protection. So I opened my laptop, pulled up the email, and stared at the blank response field. 100 words. What could I say in 100 words that would be useful, professional, and not obviously pulled directly from my own weekend wreckage? I thought about Rachel, the prenup, the Vineyard account she could no longer access. I thought about Harold and his failed injunction, about Dr. Monroe's 4 words, about the exclusion clause Rachel had triggered herself. And then I thought about wine, because lately, everything in my life seemed to orbit back to wine or vineyards or bottles that cost more than they had any right to. My fingers started typing before my brain had fully approved the plan. Trust is like wine. Give it time or it turns to vinegar. Fortunately, trust is revocable. I read it back. 20 words, well inside the limit. Clean, professional, and directly applicable to real estate planning, since revocable trusts were a legitimate, widely used structure. But also sharp, beautifully precise, aimed at my situation in a way that only people who knew the whole story would fully recognize. It was perfect. Professional enough to publish and pointed enough to satisfy something deep in my soul. I hit send before I could talk myself out of it. The editor replied within the hour, "Love this. Running it in tomorrow's digital edition. Thank you, Marcus." And that was that. I went about my Monday, real work, real clients, real phone calls, some light reorganizing because I was apparently still in a tidying phase, and didn't give the quote another thought until Tuesday morning. Tuesday morning, my phone started buzzing at 7:23, which is far too early for anyone to have strong feelings about anything. I ignored it for 4 minutes before curiosity got me and I checked to see what had happened while I was asleep. Turns out disaster was the wrong word. Phenomenon was closer. My quote had appeared in the digital edition of Wealth and Estate Quarterly, which typically received a solid but measured readership from the professional finance world, except this time, someone had screenshotted it and posted it online, and it had taken on an entire life of its own. The caption read, "Estate attorney drops the most elegant divorce-coded advice ever, with the screenshot of my quote attached. 47,000 likes and climbing. The replies were something else entirely. This is about someone specific and I absolutely need to know who. My divorce attorney quoted this in our meeting this morning. Iconic. Trust is revocable. I'm getting this tattooed, from someone who definitely shouldn't be making permanent decisions based on online content. But the genuinely fascinating part was the legal community's response. Attorneys were reposting it. Estate lawyers were sharing it with commentary. Someone had created the hashtag #TrustRevocable. Within hours, it had made its way to LinkedIn, where finance professionals were putting it up with captions like words to build by and this is exactly why we do what we do. By lunchtime, it had reached the place all viral moments eventually arrive, legal corners of the internet. And those communities did what they do best, they investigated. Wait, isn't Marcus Whitman the guy whose fiancée blindsided him with a prenup last weekend? Someone posted. Oh my God, it is. A contact at the county clerk's office told me about this whole thing. Apparently the guy restructured his entire estate before the prenup dinner even went down. The federal sovereign shelter guy, that was actually him. No wonder she can't access his money. He wrote this line after locking her out of everything. This isn't professional advice. This is a victory lap. I was sitting at my kitchen table watching my phone light up like a pinball machine, and I started laughing. Not the measured, private kind from the other night, this was full, uncontrolled laughter that might have concerned the neighbors. I hadn't planned for this. I genuinely hadn't. I just wanted to contribute one useful line to a professional journal while landing a quiet dig at my ex-fiancée. Instead, I'd accidentally become the internet's favorite bitter estate attorney, and legal Twitter had elevated me to some kind of folk hero status. My phone rang. Malcolm, already laughing before I'd finished saying hello. Dude, he said. You just broke legal Twitter. I wasn't trying to, I protested, watching the notifications stack up in real time. One sentence, Malcolm said. You wrote one sentence about wine and trust and now every attorney in 3 states is talking about Rachel without anyone saying her name. This is art. People are apparently planning tattoos. Marcus, I know. I saw. Someone tagged me asking if I was your lawyer, and I said yes. I now have 200 new followers. You've made me internet famous by association. I kept scrolling through responses. Someone had paired my quote with a side-by-side breakdown of different revocable trust structures. A law firm in Boston had put it up in their break room. A family law attorney had printed it out and taped it to her filing cabinet. And then I found the ones about Rachel. Rachel Abernathy was circulating. Not officially trending, but enough that people were drawing connections. A charity event she'd been organizing for months had been quietly cancelled. 2 speaking invitations had been removed from event websites. Friends were distancing themselves on social media in numbers significant enough that people were noticing and writing about it. I felt something that might have been a flicker of guilt. But it passed pretty quickly. I hadn't named anyone. I hadn't told the story publicly. I'd written one sentence about wine, and the internet had done the rest. If Rachel was facing social consequences, it was because people who knew her had connected the dots themselves. Grace texted, "You're trending online. Mom wants to know if this is good or bad." I replied, "Good. I think I wrote something about wine and now I'm apparently famous for being quietly petty. That's completely on brand. Mom says congratulations. Dad wants to know if you're still coming for dinner Sunday. Wouldn't miss it." My phone buzzed with an incoming call from a New York area code I didn't recognize. I answered carefully. "Mr. Whitman, this is Jennifer Park from the Wall Street Journal. I'm working on a piece about social media and professional advice, and I'd love your perspective on your viral quote." The Wall Street Journal. The actual Wall Street Journal wanted to discuss a piece of quiet revenge I dashed off in 30 seconds over morning coffee. "I appreciate the call," I said, years of professional instinct kicking in despite the surreal nature of the situation. "But I think the quote holds up on its own. Trust is central to estate planning, and like wine, it demands care and patience." "What inspired it?" she pressed. "Personal experience and professional observation," I said, which was completely true and entirely unhelpful. The best guidance usually comes from living through something. We went back and forth a few more minutes, me giving carefully diplomatic non-answers, her gently probing for confirmation it was about Rachel. I neither confirmed nor denied, which probably made the whole story more compelling than if I'd just told her everything outright. After hanging up, Malcolm called again. "Was that the Wall Street Journal? How did you?" "They rang me too, asking about federal sovereign shelter status and whether it connected to your quote. I told them I don't comment on client matters, but that your estate planning was exemplary. They're probably writing this story regardless of whether we cooperate." "Great," I said, Though genuinely, I was a little thrilled. So my breakup is going to appear in the Wall Street Journal. Your quote is going to appear in the Wall Street Journal, Malcolm clarified. Your breakup is just the subtext. There's a meaningful difference. By that evening, the quote had appeared in 3 financial newsletters, 2 legal blogs, and an Instagram account dedicated to corporate wisdom that had 800,000 followers. Someone had turned it into a motivational poster with sunset imagery and wine glasses. A law school professor had used it to open a lecture on revocable trusts. And through all of it, Rachel had gone completely dark on social media. No posts, no comments, no activity, just silence, which in the modern era is basically a white flag. I made dinner, leftover pasta from the weekend, because I believe in using what I have, and scrolled through the conversation I'd accidentally ignited. Think pieces about trust in relationships. Debates about how to do a prenup right. 17,000 people who had apparently never considered that trust was revocable and now felt very strongly about it. My favorite response came from a divorce attorney in Chicago who'd written, 20 years in family law. This quote is going on my business cards. Thank you, Marcus Whitman, for compressing my entire career into one line. I raised my glass of leftover wine, because of course I was drinking wine while reading about my wine quote going viral, and toasted to nothing in particular. The real satisfaction wasn't the attention or the notifications or even the quiet implosion of Rachel's social calendar. The real satisfaction was that I'd said something honest and useful and people had recognized it as both. Yes, it was pointed. Yes, it came directly from my situation. But it was also genuinely sound thinking about estate planning and the role of trust in protecting yourself. Trust is like wine. Give it time or it turns to vinegar. Fortunately, trust is revocable. 20 words written in 30 seconds had become the most widely shared thing I'd ever put out into the world. And I hadn't even been aiming for that. I'd just been honest about what a very strange weekend had taught me. My phone buzzed one more time. Unknown number. A text, "This is Dr. Elias Monroe. Your quote was elegant. Well done." I stared at it for a long moment, then saved the number and replied, "Thank you, sir. Your 4 words were pretty elegant too." He sent back a single thumbs up emoji, which from a legendary law professor was basically a standing ovation. I finished my wine, switched off notifications, they'd reached a genuinely unmanageable volume, and went to bed feeling like I'd stumbled into winning something I hadn't even known was a competition. Tomorrow, the internet would move on to something else. Rachel would probably start rebuilding. Harold would continue his slow reckoning with federal trust law. But tonight, I was the person who'd turned a broken engagement into a viral moment with one line about wine. And honestly, that felt pretty extraordinary. A week later, I sent Rachel the final document by certified mail, signature required, because certain things deserve a little ceremony. Inside was the formal announcement that all my significant holdings, real estate, investments, the antique collection I'd spent years building, had been moved into a charitable foundation. The Whitman Foundation for Educational Advancement, specifically. Scholarships for students who genuinely needed them, not trust fund recipients playing at generosity. But here's the elegant part. Buried in Section 4, Paragraph 3, Subsection B was a single clause that Malcolm had called the pièce de résistance. Any individual who initiates adversarial claims, including prenuptial negotiations conducted in bad faith or public coercion, shall be permanently barred from foundation benefits, advisory positions, or acknowledgement. Rachel had triggered it herself the moment she staged that dinner. She'd automatically closed every door. My foundation attorney, a brilliant woman named Diane who specialized in nonprofit law, called it self-executing poetic justice. I called it a Tuesday. Now, if Rachel ever wanted to be anywhere near my money, she'd have to make a charitable donation first. And even then, the only thing she'd be funding was scholarships for kids who weren't her. I slept incredibly well that night. Rachel made one last attempt. She called Harold, who by that point sounded like a man whose spirit had quietly packed its things and taken an extended holiday somewhere far from estate law. "Harold," she probably said, voice tight with desperation. "There has to be a way through this." Poor Harold. I almost felt something for him. Almost. "Ma'am," he said, and Malcolm told me later that Harold had started calling her ma'am instead of Miss Abernathy, which is attorney speak for I have emotionally checked out of this situation. She can't even get your name into a court document anymore. The foundation structure, the federal shelter, the exclusion clauses, it's all sealed. There has to be a loophole. There isn't. Mr. Whitman's holdings are now structured inside a living trust so layered it could survive an alien invasion. Even with the most aggressive legal team imaginable, they'd need clearance from his accountant just to get started. I do love that Malcolm had been copied on that exchange. Harold had sent it as a professional courtesy, which really translated to, "Please confirm I haven't lost my mind entirely." The funny thing was, I wasn't even angry anymore. I was entertained. Most love stories end in heartbreak. Mine ended in an IRS-approved fortress. A week later, Rachel showed up at my gate in the rain. No makeup. No entourage. No lawyer in a tuxedo. Just her, soaked through, looking like regret given human form. She stood there shivering and asked the one question I'd been expecting. "You knew I was going to ask for the prenup, didn't you?" I looked at her through the gate. This woman I'd nearly married. Someone who'd chosen control over connection at every possible turn. "I hoped you wouldn't." I slid an envelope through the bars. Inside was a letter I'd written a full year before we'd even met, back when I was just a man trying to protect himself from mistakes he could see coming from a distance. "If love ever becomes leverage, lock the vault. Marcus Whitman." She read it. The tears came, not the pretty kind from films, but the honest, ugly kind that surfaces when you realize you've dismantled something irreplaceable through your own choices. I didn't gloat. Didn't lecture. Didn't offer the satisfaction of "I told you so." I just turned around and walked back inside to make a cup of coffee. Because real consequences don't need noise or drama or flames. They just need time. And calm, my friend, is what undoes them completely.